I've lost the title. Okay, the new title is, okay, Nick is going to talk to us about a matter which he will announce to us. Please welcome Nick Bostrom.
And there we have it. Yeah, it changed a little because I was asked also to try to say something more general about this set of issues before delving into some of the issues I'm thinking about right now. So I put in this first slide, some near issues. These are things that people like to talk about when the topic of ethics of AI comes up. So self-driving cars, people love to debate that. You have a choice between running over 3 old ladies or 2 young kindergarten kids. So what should you do? You know, how many old ladies before you should run over the kindergarten kids? So I think, I mean, it's interesting, but maybe not the most important. So I mean, I think there's 1.2 million people dying on the roads every day, and it seems to me that from a practical point of view, the main issue there is just how can we roll out this technology sooner? How can we make progress on the engineering so that we can bring down that death toll? Algorithmic discrimination, so this is when more automated processes are used to make decisions, whether to allocate credit, whether to maybe give parole, or to do a lot of other choices, then it would be nice to be able to interrogate these and to see what are the bases upon which these judgments are made. It might be that we don't always think accuracy is the only criterion. We might think that there are certain kinds of that information that shouldn't filter in to how somebody is treated. So there's discussion about that, data ownership with privacy. Will firms use the information you give them to price discriminate against you? What are sort of our tolerance thresholds for that? Virtual vice, if virtual realities become more and more lifelike, then are there certain behavior, even if they don't harm anybody, that would nevertheless be intolerable, like really vivid, realistic games simulating rape, for example. You might think that's wrong, even if there is no actual victim there. Killer robots is a big topic, obviously, jobs, and then more sort of meta problems. So some people have complained about how unrepresentative the field of AI is, and among the people thinking about it, it's kind of very male-dominated, and it's a certain demographic. So does that shape the development of the field if there are only certain types of people who are sort of participating in building these technologies? So these are all, as David said, these are all legitimate issues, and I look forward to hearing a lot of conversation about these over the today and maybe tomorrow. But there's like an additional set, which is, well, so I should say that these are all, I think, can be kind of brought under the rubric. They are basically questions about how to live well and how our society should be organized now, given the current technological landscape. So how can we arrange, we have given this technology, how can we arrange this so that we have some decent outcomes? But there is an additional set of issues, which I guess I have tended to focus more on. So if one has some timescale, which I actually think looks more like this, there's the big part that comes kind of after this technology has reached maturity, and I want to say more about that. But even that's not exactly right to capture what I have in mind. You can kind of distinguish choices that we make that have only relatively short-term consequences. And so you get to remake the choice a little bit later. So we can kind of increase the taxes this year, and then if we don't like it, we can decrease them next year. We can change things around. So what I have in mind is not so much the kinds of ethical issues that arise far into the future. Rather, what I have in mind are ethical issues that might pertain to choices, if there are any such choices that we might make, that could have long-term consequences for where we end up, where Earth-originating intelligent civilization end up. And it's really those questions that are at the core of the work that we're trying to do at the Institute. So one of these is this AI alignment problem that I talked a lot about in the book. So in a certain class of scenarios, in the class of scenarios where you have a superintelligence becoming very, very powerful, and there has been a lot of discussion about this, if at some point you have that, able maybe to shape the future according to its preferences, then how can we ensure that the preferences that this AI will have will be ones that are aligned with what we want it to do so that we get some good outcome? Basically, how you could control very powerful AIs. And what we really are after here is scalable control. So there are a lot of control methods that exist now and that for the most part work perfectly fine. You have the off switch, you have like some other simple mechanism, and they are completely adequate. And you can propose more, but what really would be nice would be to have some set of control methods that are scalable in the sense that they would continue to work even as the system that you're trying to control becomes more intelligent. Ideally, they should work better the smarter the system becomes. And so some of the current things that we rely on might not be scalable in this sense. The off switch, for example, if you had a sufficiently intelligent AI, a sufficiently powerful AI, it might prevent you from switching it off, or it might anticipate your action. And a reward button might be another kind of control method that works fine as long as you have control over the reward button and you can understand what the system is doing, but it might not be scalable. So one approach to this is the idea of giving the AI goals that coincide with ours, so that the smarter the AI gets, the better it is able then to achieve our goals. And that's in principle a scalable control method, but it then faces this challenge of how you can specify what we really want accurately and in such a way that it doesn't have unforeseen consequences when really carried out to its logical limit. I argued in the book for, I call it the orthogonality thesis, which is that there is no necessary connection between intelligence and values, that in principle you could have almost any combination. You could have a really, really smart system that is really nice or really nasty or have some arbitrary goal, just as you could have a really stupid system that is nice or nasty. And we see this even within the human population. To some extent, you have all combinations, smart and dumb people are nice and evil or whatever, but this is a much larger space. One thing I would add is a lot of this is a technical engineering challenge rather than an ethics challenge. There is still the question of what kind of goal ultimately we should try to put in there. And I'd say that it's not at all clear that we would want that to be the goal of somehow optimizing the morality of its behavior, like do the thing that is the best action to do, or the action you're most confident is the right action. Because we don't really know what the true morality is. Like, suppose it turns out that it's some kind of just desert theory, and turns out that maybe we're all a little bit rotten, so maybe we all just deserve a damn good spanking. And it's like you have the future optimized according to this maybe maximally morally correct, or some ice bucket challenge or something like that just goes on forever. I mean, who knows really what the sort of truth about all these moral. So if you think of morality as maybe some way to organize ethical intuitions in some reflective equilibrium with other things, like who knows what would come out of that. And if you really put in as this unalterable goal in a very powerful optimization process, it might not be anything that we really would want at all. So maybe morality is some kind of ingredient there, but it might not be so clear that we really, on reflection, would want this to do the morally optimal thing. So there is this, but then there is this parallel challenge. So assuming you could solve the technical challenge of how to put human intentions, human goals reliably into an arbitrarily powerful intelligence, there is still then this political question that we confront, like which goals to put in, who should decide, what is the overall set of governance structures that should guide our approach into this more AI-enabled future. And so this is an area where work is at an even earlier stage. So the control problem, I mean, a few years ago, there was almost nothing. There were like a couple of groups in the world who were thinking at all about that, and that has changed over the last couple of years, and it's really amazing to see new centers springing up and research papers are starting to get published on that. But this is at an earlier stage. This is maybe where work on the technical control problem was a few years ago. So there isn't anything very complete or thought through to present here, but I want to just talk a little bit about some sort of work in progress that I'm doing together with Carrick Flynn and Daniel Defoe. I think Daniel is in the audience here somewhere. We haven't had a chance to necessarily sync up on exactly all of these things I show on the slides, but these are some thoughts about how one might begin to think about this. So what I would like to do as a first step is to think about what are so suppose somebody proposed some vision for how this should be governed, some roadmap, what are the properties that one would like such a proposal to have in order for us to think that's a good proposal, that's something we could get behind. And in particular, we can look at these sort of normativity disorder, like what are these different rubrics. We'll look at some examples within each one of these. Of types of features that it would be nice if our sort of proposal for how humanity should move forward to this would have. I suggest that a useful focus here is maybe not so much what's sort of the end state, but more we could try to evaluate paths forward that start from where we are now and then lead somewhere into the future, because one might have preferences or intuitions not just about the destination, but also about how the decisions as to how to move forward should go on, the overall shape of this. We need to combine it at some point, sooner rather than later, with considerations about feasibility. So we want some proposal that actually could work, not just something that would be nice in an ideal world. And it's important there to consider the second best option. So you might have a view about what should be the best, but you might also want to have views. You might almost want to have a vector field, as it were, with kind of views about what should happen in any different situation where you might end up. Or if you're advising somebody and there is like the best thing that they should do, but for whatever reason they are just unwilling to do that, you might still want to have a view about where on the margin, where should I go if you could just kind of push them to do a little bit more of one thing or another. And we also want to consider commitment mechanisms whereby early choices might lock in later choices. So let's just briefly go through some thoughts on this. So on the efficiency, we want to look at what is different in this context of machine superintelligence. So there are obviously all kinds of considerations that apply here just as they apply to all the other things we do, but there are perhaps certain distinctive issues or ones that have more weight in this context. So AI safety work seems like an important thing here, and getting an efficient outcome, meaning one that is kind of just increases the size of the pie available, particularly by reducing the risk externalities that could come from this. So if this transition to the machine intelligence era happens, all humans, wherever you are on Earth, even if you're sitting in a little hut in Indonesia and have had no vote or input on this, you still, if there are going to be risks, you're still going to also face those risks. So it seems that one thing one can do is to recognize an obligation there to put an extra effort on that, timely development and rollout in terms of the enormous benefits that can come from this. There is a kind of arguably an urgency there, in particular insofar as we care about people who exist now, as opposed to impartially about bringing new people into existence to replace us. But if the goal is to benefit the 7 billion people right now, the clock is running out, like we are dying and suffering all kinds of ills. Avoiding global coordination failure. So there's a distinct, and I don't really have time to go into them, but there's a certain class of ways in which things could go wrong, and I think it's a large chunk of all the different ways that things could go wrong because there is a failure at the global level to coordinate. That's why we can have wars and arms races and destruction of the global commons and Malthusian outcomes and so forth. Considering this vulnerable world hypothesis, for want of a better name, you could consider this hypothesis that there is some level of technological development at which offense strongly dominates defense, in the sense that at that level of technology, it would be feasible for a small group to take some action that would lead to the destruction of the world independently of what other people do after that action has been taken. So we don't know whether the vulnerable world hypothesis is true, but maybe it is. And then you can think about, if it is true, what are the kind of arrangements that would have been put in place so that we can maintain the world intact, even when it enters such a vulnerable phase. And so this ability to undertake some kind of stabilization of the world, if that should be necessary, some way to, if there is some really dangerous technology that just would be much more easier to use to cause destruction, then maybe there would have to be some way to prevent either the proliferation of that or to very closely monitor its use. And that seems like another important variable to consider when looking at different paths forwards. Do they allow for conditional stabilization? Are they such that if it turns out that the world is vulnerable in this sense, that the world could then be stabilized, the control could be centralized, if that should be necessary? Or is the development just such that there is no way for anybody or any group of people to kind of rein it in or steer it? Allocation, so again, yeah, we all have this risk externality. Also, there is this kind of bonanza that would have, if this goes well, the amount of wealth and prosperity unlocked is enormous. It's this giant windfall. You kind of open up not just technological maturity here on Earth, but also all the space resources that our descendants can start to colonize. Economic growth for a period of time may become extremely rapid. Robin Hanson has a recent book where he discusses the world economy doubling every month or so for a period of a couple of years. And so you could have this explosive growth in productivity, which also, I think, changes the allocational question somewhat. So it's more, if you have such a large abundance, it becomes more plausible, I think, that if you could give everybody a really superb life in great prosperity, even by just carving out sort of 1% or 0.1% of the overall resource pie, then it seems to become much more of a no-brainer that you should at least do that. Whereas right now, there are more kind of trade-offs. Like some people would have to give up significant wealth in order for everybody to have a good life, or you might worry about economic incentives if you tax people too much. But this would be a unique situation where you might argue that there should perhaps be some kind of basic allotment. And another interesting feature here is that we are currently, to a large extent, behind the veil of ignorance. Nobody knows when superintelligence will be developed, who will develop it, for what purposes. So we kind of all have a shared interest, if we could, in reaching an agreement now to some kind of reasonably equitable distribution of influence and wealth of the benefits. It's like an insurance scheme. You would rather have a certainty of getting a 7th billionth slice of this than having 1 in a 7 billionth chance of getting all of it, because there are diminishing returns to wealth and power. So you might think that could argue for some kind of continuity, that if there are pathways that don't completely reshuffle the deck and just make some random set of people the winners and some other people the losers, but instead something that was more continuous with the existing status quo distribution, that could be a desirable feature. Then we have this set of issues that concern the creation of new people or new morally relevant entities, with the possibility of mind crime, as I call them. So right now we think of our computers as just objects. You could take a hammer and smash them, and it doesn't really matter. The only question right now is, how do the computers affect us? Right now, it doesn't matter how we affect the computers, because they don't matter. But you could argue that at some point they might well start to matter. I've proposed a couple of principles that include this principle of substrate non-discrimination, so that if you had something that was functionally and mentally equivalent, it wouldn't, from a moral point of view, fundamentally matter what its substrate of implementation was, whether it was silicon in a digital computer or carbon in a human brain, if they had the same functional properties and the same mental states, that would be no more relevant than whether your skin is white or black. Another would be a principle of ontogeny, non-discrimination, so that holding fixed what you are, it shouldn't matter how you were created. At least I think these are principles to consider. It might well be that we need to qualify them, but as a starting point, another would be a principle of subjective time. So if there are cases where it matters morally how long something continues for. Say, if somebody is suffering, it's worth if they suffer for 10 minutes than if they suffer for 5 minutes. And if you could prevent either 5 minutes of one person's suffering or 10 minutes of somebody else's suffering, you should, other things equal, prefer to prevent the 10-minute suffering. In those cases, when you have digital minds, there are two different senses of time that can come apart, because if you run the same mind on a faster computer, its subjective rate of time will go faster, even though clock time will remain the same. So the question then arises, which of these two senses of time are morally relevant? And I suggest that it's the subjective sense of time. So if you run an upload mind twice as fast, then it kind of accumulates moral weight twice as fast as well. But these are, even if these were correct, they would only scratch the surface. There is like all kinds of exotic minds with weird preferences and strange properties that nobody has yet thought about, even what we think would be their moral status. So in addition to trying to prevent mind crime, we're seeing it as a desideratum of a path forward, that it reduces the amount of mind. And by the way, so this doesn't only arise once you have sort of human level things living in machines. It could arise a lot sooner. We think that a lot of animals have moral status. And maybe once you have AIs, say with similar capabilities as a mouse or something like that, you should start to think about whether we should accord it similar moral status as we do it. If you want to do medical experiments on a mouse, you have to go through an ethics committee, and you have to like anesthetize the mouse. And it's not so much whether you kill the mouse at the end, but it's like that it doesn't suffer needless. Anyway, so that can arise a lot sooner. And it seems like a silly thing right now, but I think it will go from silly to controversial at some point in maybe the next 15 years or so. Then we also have this ease with which you can produce more offspring or copies. So with humans, it's a slope. But here you could, in principle, instantaneously copy yourself, assuming available hardware. So you then have an immediate conflict between two moral intuitions we have, this sort of reproductive freedom. Everybody should decide for themselves how many kids they want to have, and the idea that maybe there should be some minimum welfare standard, at least for kids. But if you combine these two, then it just doesn't work, right? Because you have even one person who just likes to make more and more copies. They can sort of very quickly eat up the entire resource pool, and you have an immediate descent into Malthusian condition. Voting, similarly, if you could sort of just give yourself more votes by duplicating yourself, kind of distorts the system. So maybe you would need to move to some voting based on your wealth, or you have each person has a suffrage token that can get split amongst their descendants or something like that. Process. So in addition to these kind of more outcome-based properties, we might also care about how these outcomes are decided and what happens along the trajectory. In particular, one might have intuitions favoring some sort of legitimacy, that you want when whatever. Maybe you think, I don't know exactly how the future should be, but I would want it to be determined by legitimate processes. And exactly what is legitimate here can be complicated. It might not be enough to say, have somebody consenting to it. I mean, suppose it were the case that a sufficiently advanced AI could persuade you into anything by sort of structuring a set of arguments and stimuli in an appropriate way, then consent might not be sufficient. And finally, we might have a discussion about some of the meta. So if there are these different desiderata that might not all be completely satisfiable, and we have to trade off different degrees of satisfaction. So how should we do that? I propose this parliamentary model where you kind of think of suppose you have different moral theories making different claims, you can think of each moral theory as a party that gets to send delegates to this imaginary parliament of deliberation. And each theory gets to send a number of delegates proportional to the probability you give to that moral theory. And then you imagine this parliament kind of deliberating, and whatever that parliament would then decide is what you should do. And the idea here is that they can trade among one another. So if some moral theory, maybe you think it's only 30% likely, but it really cares a lot about one particular choice. Maybe that theory gets its way on that choice, and maybe it kind of defers to other theories on other choices. And you could expand this to include not just moral theories, but maybe you have self-interest or different constituencies. You can kind of, so it's a sort of, tries to be a robust way to achieve compromise solutions that allow for wins. Finally, also, in addition, it might become important what the decision theory and the epistemology is that determines the long-term future. And then one might make some proposal there that should be based on the actual decision theory that humans have, or that we would on reflection have, or something like that. So that's all that I have time for, folks. Look forward to the next 2 days. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have some time for, stay up here because we have time for a few questions. Just a little bit about how this works. We'll have 3 talks, most of which will be 20 minutes. Each of them will be followed by 10 minutes or so for a Q&A for the individual talks. After all 3 talks, we'll get all 3 speakers on stage, and there'll be a chance for a bit of interaction among the group and questions from the audience. But for now, we've got time for a few questions for Nick. We have people, John will run the mic, looking for hands for questions. There's one there. There we go.
Hi, thank you. My name is Heather. My question is, you raised several issues about government, which is very interesting to me because I used to work for the United Nations and I'm a human rights lawyer. I've noticed that as technology evolves, government also evolves. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think the evolution of government is anywhere near close to being able to deal with the kind of challenges that the technology is now posing. And people think of parallels with like the nuclear arms race, and was our government development in line with what we were technologically capable of?
The government is what it is. I mean, it would be nice if it improves, and I think there are a lot of exciting ideas for how you could do that. I mean, it strikes me, though, that so there are these, I know some people who are into, say, these cryptocurrencies and Ethereum, and they envisage sort of some decentralized system that nobody has, but that often the very first use case they think of is, so maybe the United States could run like this. It seems to me that there should be a very long trajectory between a cool new idea and applying it to some kind of world-important system, that you would want to try it on small scales first. And then if it still looks like a good idea half a century or 2 centuries later, then maybe you would really want to like apply it to the things that matter most. I mean, it's such a big question how technology can, I mean, I think there are low-hanging fruits that, so one thing I've always thought would be cool is to have a prediction market, a well-subsidized prediction market on policy futures. So you could see the running odds of the likely consequences of adopting a certain policy. Like if you raise the tax rate 5%, will economic growth be higher or lower 5 years down the line? If you close the border to Mexico, will there be more or fewer terrorist incidents? And so you could have speculators betting on these things, and then kind of read out from that some kind of market probability estimate that could maybe discipline some of the speculations. But it is a hard thing to do. So there's this technical control problem, and there is this governance problem. Arguably, they are equally important in the sense that they shape the outcome equally, but it might be a lot more important to work on the technical problem because it's just harder to have a big impact on the, even if you thought out all the answers to this kind of set of governance issues, it's just much less obvious how that would impact what actually happens. And if you come up with a really clever technical solution to the control problem, there's a good chance that it will be implemented. So in that sense, that might be less important.
Okay,
Yes, thank you. I wanted to draw you out on something that's a classical angle to this whole thing, which is that it seemed to me that the interest of a lot of the questions that you're asking is premised on the systems in question being conscious. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is whether you thought that was true, or whether you thought, no, as long as they're complex enough, it doesn't really matter whether they're conscious in the familiar sense. Of course, the question how you tell, I don't just mean the question of what consciousness is, but the question how you tell whether a certain organism or a unit is conscious is much debated, but one with no clear solution. And so I was surprised that it played virtually no role in the way you were laying out the landscape of the issues.
Well, I think the only set of issues that depends on whether the machines are conscious is mind crime, where it matters for whether we think it makes a difference morally, whether the thing in the box is conscious or not. But for the other purposes, in terms of thinking about how machines affect the human condition, I think one can abstract away from that. What's relevant are their functional attributes. And I think it's an open question how easy it is, say, to build something that is not conscious but still performs at a very high level of intelligence. We just don't know whether sort of the easiest way to achieve versatile general intelligence involves something that we would on reflection think probably is conscious, or whether the easiest way to do that is through some very different architecture that we wouldn't think is conscious. I'm very uncertain about that.
Hi. So my question is actually a little bit similar to what his question was. I was interested in your principles of substrate non-discrimination and ontology non-discrimination. I came to this conference thinking the ethical implications of artificial intelligence more relied upon the implementation of these systems in society. I didn't consider actually having to respect these systems as possibly being conscious or some form of human intelligence. So my question first was, how do you determine if something is a mind to be respected? And also, should there be any difference at all between, say, a human mind and a simulation of a human mind in, say, an experiment?
So you're right on the first, that for the most part, the issue is about, certainly the present issues, is about how we humans use these machines and how they affect us. I was introducing this as it's actually an issue that has been very little discussed, but that could be important. If nothing else, because of just the sheer numbers, that it is very easy in certain kinds of machine learning training and experiments to create huge numbers of these systems. So if they had some moral status, then if you have any kind of aggregative intuitions where how much something matters depends on how many people are affected or how many minds are engaged in it, it could possibly come to dominate the sum total of say human minds that have existed through history at some point. But this is a kind of a niche issue at the moment, and I gave it some time precisely because it has been neglected. So I wasn't trying to allocate my speaking time proportionally to how much people have actually been talking about these different things.
Of the things you've mentioned, what is humanity most likely to fail at?
To fail at?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the mind crime thing is fairly likely to fail at that, because if you look at the difficulties we have in extending empathy to animals, we still have a long way to go there, I think. And animals have faces and they can squeak. But if these were invisible processes happening in a microprocessor, it would be so much harder to see that we might want to take that into account. To give a more detailed answer is hard because you would have to sort of distinguish degrees of failing at something. The real question is maybe not what are we most likely to fail at, but where on the margin could, say, the efforts by one extra person or one extra dollar most decrease the chance of failing in a way that would make a profound difference to the future. And it might be that working on something that we're probably going to succeed at, but where maybe you could reduce the risk that we will fail at it by a small fraction might be better than working on the most likely failure point. But anyway, so that becomes a more complicated conversation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.